Are you excited to reach the end of this process? I think it took a while, didn't it?
It did take a while. I am excited to be at the end of it. My job here, the thing that I'd initially said to Professor Chomsky at the outset of this project was we want to distill your critique of US foreign policy. I want to go back through everything that you've said and written and the work with you to bring out so that some of the crucial points, update them. And I don't know. I think some of your listeners, viewers might know this, but going through everything that Noam Chomsky has said over the course of 50 years
Right.
means going through dozens upon dozens upon dozens of books. It's well over 100 books that he has published previously, plus all the lectures, plus all the interviews, plus all the published correspondence. If you go to, I think, chomsky.info, you can see this vast archive of Chomsky material. And my job as the in this process was to start out by going through all of that and then go to him with things that I thought were valuable and work with him to kind of revise them. But it was mammoth. It was gargantuan.
And what's fascinating about it is that this is only a fraction of his intellectual output, since he also did
Oh
all
yeah, there's the
work
whole
in
other side to it
linguistics.
too.
Yeah, very highly technical work. And by the way, just as controversial from what I understand,
Yeah.
not someone who shies away from a fight wherever.
No.
I've always been fascinated by Chomsky, the figure over the years, because while his writing is dense, it is filled with jewels that are worth digging for. But the videos you see of him going back 50 years, I mean, it amazes me.
Hmm.
I'm old, but when I was a kid, he was going on TV more than
Hmm.
in recent years because you actually had a place for dissident intellectuals on television in those days. But when I looked at some of these old videos, also filled with ideas, also very pointed when he needed to be, but how do I put it? Very engaging. I mean,
Hmm.
it's not, I don't know, you've seen a lot more of them than I have, but the videos that I've seen, it's not work to listen to them. It hooks you in right away, like a lecture,
Hmm.
like a good lecture. I don't know,
Hmm.
but maybe you found otherwise.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. I mean, he has a way of putting very, very powerful in debates. I always like it, the best Chomsky videos to watch are to watch him with hostile questioners because
Uh,
that's when you really see the full force of his intellect come out because people ask questions, whether it's William F. Buckley or Richard Pearl he debated, or David Frum asked him a question at one point, Alan Dershowitz. When you watch these debates, David Frum asked him what he thought was a very clever question. He said, why don't you care why do you only care about the victims of your own country? Why don't you care about the Kurds, for instance? And then, Chomsky comes out with this fantastic monologue, which is sort of a version of which appears in this book, where he explains why it's morally necessary to focus primarily on your own country's crimes. And it has nothing to do with downplaying the crimes of other countries or excusing the crimes of other countries, and everything to do with the fact that we are responsible for the actions of our own government. And so that should be our area of interest. And when he says it, you realize instantly when he says it, you go, oh, okay, that makes sense.
right. And
That's so simple. That's so obvious. But it isn't obvious, right? He says things that, you know,
the are you
obvious
there?
when he says them, but they're not obvious until he says them.
All right. In terms of this obligation to for us as people like you and me and Professor Chomsky to hold our own government to account, actually, that I don't want to spoil the ending of the book for people who don't know how it turns out, but that's one of the things you and he say in the conclusion that that those who have the once we see the consequences of the attempt, and I'm quoting you guys, of the attempt to impose U.S. hegemony through force, we have an obligation to oppose it. It's a fundamental duty of the citizen to resist and restrain the violence of the state. I hear the echo of that experience with the folks like David Frum and this resonates so well today. It is cheap and easy to deplore the crimes of others while dismissing or justifying our own. As a good thumbnail summary of every debate on foreign policy I've seen on the news and the mainstream
Mhm.
news for quite some time. So, and I will also say, as long as we're talking about the responsibility to act, that you guys, you were channeling Gramsci there, Antonio Gramsci at the end. You had a lot of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will in there. I thought.
Yeah.
Do you think
So
that accurately reflect?
yeah, well, Chomsky likes to quote that actually. He likes that
Oh, did he?
Gramsci quote a lot because he's definitely uh, intellectually pessimistic when you hear him talk about the prospects for human civilization in an age of climate catastrophe and great power conflict. Sometimes it's pretty bleak, but nevertheless, someone who, up until the recent decline in his health, was doing, you know, multiple interviews every single day, going on every little YouTube show that he could to kind of give his analysis and his warnings. Yeah, as you say that the book deliberately concludes on that kind of hopeful note, where we talk about social movements of the past and what they've managed to accomplish and the changes that he had seen in the course of his lifetime. Because one of the things he was asked about when he was asked, what can activists accomplish? What can they do? Which was a common question that has been put to him. He would say, well, look, when I started doing this in the 19 when I started as an activist in the 60s, he'd say, at that time, like spousal rape was legal in most US states, right? Like it was very, he said he would cite the textbooks. He quoted from the textbooks that his kids had been taught within the Massachusetts public schools in the 1960s, where like the genocide of Native Americans was glorified. Like it was just outright glorified. And, at that time, the way before the anti-war movement took off, the way that the U.S. actions in Vietnam were talked about, were just Vietnamese lives were just totally irrelevant. I mean, they might as well the Vietnamese people might as well not exist. And there were huge changes as a result of activist pressure. So, I mean, he's always been careful to credit those changes and to use them as a demonstration of what can actually be accomplished when people take seriously that responsibility to act.
And and it comes through in the book too. And again, we're talking about the book, The Myth of American Idealism by Noam Chomsky and Nathan J. Robinson, and Nathan's with us. Um, it comes through the moral clarity that you have, that I hope I have, but certainly that Professor Chomsky has had for 60 years or whatever it's been, where what comes with that clarity is an absolute absence, as far as any I can tell, of fear. A kind of well, he knows what he sees, and he's clear about it. If you give him contrary information, he'll consider it. But a David Frum or a William F. Buckley or one of these other or a bad, poorly informed journalist or whatever writing a hit piece. These things are not going to. Never saw him ruffled by that because it seemed to
No.
me he had this kind of mathematical fixity about what he saw, and
The world's most unruffled and unruffleable person, perhaps.
that's a good example for someone like me who is inherently ruffleable.
Hmm.
Um, And I've always admired that. When I get
Yeah.
into debate with someone, I do okay, but then my blood pressure doesn't go down for, well, I don't know my blood pressure, but
Yeah.
my metabolism doesn't calm down for 48 hours. I don't have a feeling that Noam Chomsky ever had that problem.
Yeah.
Um, so the first half of the book or so lays out all the, or not all, but a number of U.S. Imperial hegemonic war crimes of
Mm.
the primarily 20th and 21st century, 8 of them to be specific. And what was the purpose there in laying them all out?
Well, what we say in the introduction to the book is that I mean the opening of the book says every ruling power tells itself stories to justify its rule. And what it shows, what we show in that introduction is that every country's leaders in their own self-presentation are doing good for the world, even when they're clearly not doing good for the world, even when it's the Japanese Empire in the 1930s. And as a result, what we say is that if you're going to evaluate a country's actions, you can't just pay attention to the rhetoric of you can't pay attention to the rhetoric, to the narrative, to the mythology, because you don't know whether that's true until you go deep on the facts, and you have to check the record against the rhetoric. And so in the United States, we have all of these stories about how we spread the blessings of freedom and democracy and human rights around the world. Those stories are worthless in and of themselves because we would tell them whether or not they were true. So the question is, are they true? And in order to find out whether they're true, what we say is you have to go through and do case studies. You have to go through and check the facts. So what we do is we go through the major areas of conflict over the course of the last 50 years, from the Vietnam War to Central America in the 80s to the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, the conflict with Russia over Ukraine. We go through,
Right.
this series of areas, and we examine the stories that were told and what actually happened. And we think that that presentation is a good way of telling you whether the myths, in fact, hold up to scrutiny.
Yes, well said. And of those 8 or so examples, the ones that really struck me for a couple of different reasons uh, were, I mean, a lot of us know about the war in Southeast Asia or Afghanistan, Iraq, all very much worth recapping, all very important. But for example, at one point in the book, and I'm not sure if I don't think it's part of that segment, but I'm not sure, you talk about a horrific war crime that far too few Americans know about and understand, and that's the absolute slaughter of leftists, communist socialists, intellectuals in Indonesia. And
Yeah.
our extreme complicity in that by providing the aircraft, especially, and other weaponry that enabled Suharto, the dictator there, to do that. Um, Hundreds of thousands of people dying. I've talked to people who say that Indonesia as a society now, 50 years later, has not recovered. There's no functional left. The
Mm.
intellectual classes has been stripped bare and so on. So the bloodshed was horrific, massive, extreme in its violence. And yet that somehow disappeared down the American memory a whole, it seems.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I mean, there have been a few scholars and writers in recent years who have really excavated what happened, including I think Jeffrey Robinson wrote a book on this, and Vincent Bevins did the excellent book, The Jakarta Method, where they brought this to light. I mean, this is one of the worst mass slaughters of the 20th century, where up to 500,000 communists and suspected communists and vaguely lefty people were just systematically killed by the Indonesian government with the full support of the United States, which celebrated it, which saw this as great news. Even the New York Times celebrated this massacre, saying it was like one of the things they considered part of a gleam of light in Asia. And the idea was that America's enemies were being pushed back. And it's just so horrendous. And we have all the testimonies of CIA officials who said, yes, we helped them. We gave them lists of communists to liquidate. And so there's no real dispute about it. It just doesn't. I mean, Bevins says, and I think we quote him in the book. Says, this goes in the memory hole because it's so far from what we want to believe that
Right.
we are, where we want to believe that we would only do something by mistake. I mean, we talk a lot about in the book about how, you're allowed to criticize the United States government, but the criticisms usually that you hear are well-intentioned mistake theory. That's like what Ken Burns describes the Vietnam War as. It was launched by men who had good intentions, but then it all went wrong. Well, the Indonesian massacres are very difficult to defend I mean, this is just
Right.
wholesale extermination. And so because it doesn't fit, Bevins says, it has to disappear because we can't reconcile it with our self-conceptions. Even though if you were to tell an honest history, it would be a really, really important event in the history book.
Right. And the fact that some of this violence took place under Jimmy Carter, which I think it's important that you and Professor Chomsky emphasize, and I'm quite
Yeah, that's
fond
the
of
East Timor
Jimmy.
stuff later on. Yeah.
Yeah, the East Timor portion of it, which was horrific also. I think it's valuable because, like many people, I'm quite fond of Jimmy Carter in many ways.
Yeah.
But, it makes you wonder, and you answer this question, which I think a lot of these historical accounts don't. Well, how could such a thing happen? Carter seems like a decent man. We think of ourselves as a decent country. And there's such a great, you quote Clinton Fernandez, who wrote The
Mhm.
Independence of East Timor, a study on that, saying that, quote, for Indonesia, the military objective of destroying the resistance overrode all other considerations, while, quote, for Western governments, the maintenance of good relations with the Suharto regime took priority for financial and tactical and other reasons, I assume. So there you have it. And it seems to me that those two sentences from Clinton Fernandez
Mhm.
explain a lot about what we do around the world, including what's going on now in Gaza. Not so much that we have a government that just is into genocide per se, but the elimination of the Palestinians as an Israeli objective and maintenance of good relations with the Israeli government is our objective. And so the utter indifference in a way is equally monstrous. I mean, that's what I took away from it.
Yeah, and you have many of these cases where it may well be that Jimmy Carter sincerely committed to human rights. He came in emphasizing human rights. He ended up supporting a number of human rights abusing governments around the world, including the Shah in Iran,
Right.
including in Central America. How does this happen? We might ask. How do people who might be sincerely committed to human rights end up supporting human rights abuses? Well, it's similar to what happened with Saudi Arabia after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, right? Mohammed bin Salman just orders the dismemberment of a dissident. who happens to be a columnist for the Washington Post, right? So he's not even just a Saudi dissident. He has ties to the United States, and
And the
so
dismemberment happens here in Washington, D.C.
well, it
So,
happened. No, it's in Turkey. I think Turkey,
oh,
the
Turkey, that's
Saudi
right. Excuse me.
embassy in Turkey. But
Right, right, right,
Khashoggi had spent a lot of time in the United States.
right.
And in fact, these sorts of things have happened in DC too, like the killing of the dissident against Pinochet, who
Orlando
was
Letelier.
yeah, the
Yeah,
Letelier who was killed in DC.
yeah.
So it happens in DC as well. But what happens is that Khashoggi's family is pleading with the Biden administration. You have to hold this regime accountable. They just dismembered him, right? They just it's such a blatant, grotesque human rights violation. And the Biden administration makes clear that they're not going to do anything other than sort of lament this. In fact, I believe they blocked or tried to block a lawsuit against MBS from going forward over the killing of Khashoggi. And why? Well, the answer is pretty simple, which is that the interest in maintaining good relations with the Saudi government is considered far more important than what happened to one guy. That doesn't mean anything. So
And if you look at, I believe Biden also did a fist bump or something with
he
MBS,
fist bumped, yeah.
but if you look at Jimmy Carter, he lost re-election. I think a lot of people believe because of the hostage situation. I certainly think that was a major
Yeah,
factor. The hostage situation occurred because of the vehement anti-American sentiment triggered during the Iranian Revolution by Jimmy Carter admitting the Shah of Iran to the United States
that's
for
right.
medical treatment.
Right.
So it could be that if one is total hypothetical, counterfactual, all those things, but his original values would have served him as a leader certainly better than.
Well, you point to something which is somewhat peculiar, which is that when presidents harm their own self-interest for things that don't preserve human rights, don't uphold morality, and also, I mean, we can sort of understand why you would make a Machiavellian calculation that your own self-interest was more important than human rights. But if you look at something like the career of Lyndon Johnson or Joe Biden's support for Israel, there you see presidents undermining their own popularity as the public turns against them for their support of unconscionable acts. And there, I think you have a kind of psychological mystery as to why they are pathologically committed to these policies that are clearly getting worse, and they're not willing to change course. Why Lyndon Johnson kept doubling down in Vietnam, even as it destroyed his own presidency, is a mystery for the ages, upon which I think biographers can speculate, but I don't know that we can come up with a definitive answer.
And we have that, as you say, with Biden. Kamala Harris is putting her Michigan. I did a in-depth analysis on the polling and the demographics of Muslims and Arab Americans and others in swing states. She's putting her candidacy very much at risk by not
Yeah,
simply using stronger rhetoric. She doesn't have
yeah.
to take action because she's not the president. She can argue she can't. And there too, whether it was when Biden was the candidate or now, I will confess I've had these moments of really that's the hill you're willing to die on as a candidate, not Medicare for all, not higher education, not eliminating poverty, but this. And that I think is very much connected to the thesis of your book with Professor Chomsky.
Yeah. I just interviewed Dr. Feroz Sidwa, who wrote the New York Times op-ed with 65 doctors who'd served in Gaza. And they just sent a letter from 99 healthcare professionals who'd worked in Gaza to the Biden administration earlier this month, pleading with the Biden administration to just meet with them, to just hear what's going on in Gaza. And they said, they say in that letter, we think that if you understood the crimes that are being committed using U.S. weapons, you wouldn't be able to support them. Well, I asked him, I said, gotten any response to this letter whatsoever? He said, no, we've gotten absolutely nothing, zero, nothing. Um, and it's a little strange in a certain way because, and I think I'm more interested and puzzled by this than perhaps Professor Chomsky would be because he's sort of very cynical about the powerful, whereas I'm kind of fascinated by, how can you diverge that much from what the population wants? How can you support a what is obviously a catastrophe, even as it's becoming a worse and worse catastrophe? Again, like Lyndon Johnson fascinates me, right? I mean, he knew he could see it all unraveling. I mean, he could see that he was destroying his own career. And he could see that he wasn't even getting anything for the people of the United States or the people of Vietnam. So I'm sure you know the great Pete Seeger song, "Waist Deep in the Big Muddy,"
And the big
and the big
fool
fool
says
said to
to
push
push.
on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Johnson, people don't understand how complex a figure he was anymore. A lot of people know he did a lot of great things, Civil Rights Act, Medicare, and so on. But in the Senate, he was known as the senator from Brown and Root. Brown and Root being the Texas company that was the predecessor to Halliburton. So who knows what types of threats and or promises are
Mm,
made to someone like that. I mean, I've assumed that, although I don't really know, that donors have had something to do with. I mean, we saw the donors force Joe Biden to step down, which I think was the right
mm,
decision, but he wasn't going to do it without them. And that's not very democratic, but I wonder to what extent the donors, the millionaires and billionaires, as my old boss would say, uh,
yeah,
aren't pushing this. In any case, I
yeah,
guess I don't know if we'll ever know, but like you, I am fascinated. I can't just write off, they're all bastards. I mean, I want to
yeah,
know the mechanics of how
yeah.
values get, and even self-interest, which is what's really fascinating, gets perverted in all this.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
before I let you go, I'm sorry, did you have anything more to
No,
say?
no.
The Before I let you go, the other section of the book, and the second half talks about the domestic roots of our foreign policy, which is important. We've talked about that already, kind of through it, but is the great China threat? Because here's one where, on his own,
Mm,
I think Professor Chomsky would have had more to say had he had the time, uh, separate from this book. So I think it's good to hear his view and yours on this. Begins with the section, "The Great China Threat," talks about this is something that's fascinated me too. Everybody in the media and a lot of people I know just kind of accept that China's our enemy, but nobody ever says,
yeah,
well, why? I mean, the same people who are saying on the Democratic Party side that China is our enemy are the ones who signed the trade deal and sent, a million or two jobs over there. It's like, why, if you're gonna like irrationally hate them, why didn't you do that before giving them all these manufacturing jobs? So I assume that fiscal, corporate interests, financial interests are involved in this, but the sort of mindless terror of a nation with which we used to collaborate from Nixon through Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. It's bizarre to me. Isn't it the same to you? Or
could
maybe
you just
not.
repeat that last sentence because you just cut out for that last sentence?
Oh, I said that this sudden transition from uh, all the deal making we were doing with China from
Yeah,
Richard Nixon through George W. Bush, now all of a sudden it's just a given that they're our enemy as a
yeah,
bipartisan consensus and we're arming up and everything else. It's bizarre, I said to me. And
yeah.
is it bizarre to you?
Yeah, well, it's bizarre, but it's not unprecedented because one of the things, I mean, you'll notice over the course of this book, one of the nice things about going through with the different case studies is that you notice patterns recurring, and the creation of a terrifying enemy hell bent on destroying the American way of life because that's it's intrinsic to their nature, and it's us or them, and they're coming for us. I mean, this was used in Vietnam, the suggestion if we don't fight them over there, we're going to be fighting them here, as if like Ho Chi Minh was going to float over the Pacific Ocean, and
Right.
and the same is true with the war on terror rhetoric. If we don't fight them there, we're going to be fighting them here. And and the same patterns are used in drumming up support for a militaristic stance towards China, which is to say, well, China's a threat. Well, usually a lot of bad conflation is done where the idea is often like, if China poses a threat to Taiwan, which it certainly does, then that is used to justify China posing a threat to us. Now, not to diminish the importance of the threat of China to Taiwanese autonomy, which is serious and real, which we acknowledge in the book, although we say that the United States is actually making that threat worse by making it more likely that China would want to reclaim Taiwan by force. But that's different from a threat to us. We also point out that, for example, the Chinese abuse of the Uyghurs is real. It's serious. It's a serious human rights abuse. But when people use that as part of their evidence that China is a threat, the treatment of the internal population is not usually used to demonstrate a threat. That's obviously not how we
Right.
approach the Saudi government, right? We don't say, because they execute their dissidents, they therefore pose a threat to us. So different standards are applied, which is another strong theme of the book, is showing how inconsistent standards are used for evaluating allied states versus enemy states. But so the construction of this China threat is done using many of the same techniques that are used to terrify the American people about, or that were used to terrify them about the Soviet Union, that were used to terrify them about the marauding, the Muslim fundamentalists who were
Right.
going to come and destroy, the whole country for no good reason except that they hate our freedoms.
Right. And by the way, just a shout out to Robert Mueller, who became a progressive hero, but and James Comey, who at one point was a progressive hero until he said negative things about Hillary Clinton right before the elections. But Comey once said regarding Islamic terrorism that there were 5,000 sleeper cells in the United States ready to strike. He said that when he was FBI director, sort of serving this broader agenda that you and Professor Chomsky describe in the book. So whether it's a massive, the largest, or perhaps now India, but one of the largest states in the world, like China, or a ragtag group of terrorists in the Middle East, we're always willing to frame them as an existential threat in order to
Yeah.
spend unlimited
Yeah.
amounts of money on war. But we're running out of time. So, in closing, you come to this chapter in your life has come to an end with
Mhm.
the publication of The Myth of American Idealism. How you feel? You
Eh,
pleased with it?
Well, it's bittersweet because on the one hand, I feel very proud of this book, and I'm very glad that I got to work with someone who's my intellectual hero, Noam Chomsky. We got it done basically under the wire because his health declined severely during the last phases of the book. So, I mean, I think, my gosh, how lucky I was to be able to put this together. It's looking like it might be his final book, and I think it's a very powerful statement of his message. On the other hand, it's pretty depressing material.
Yeah.
So people will say, "Wow, that must be amazing. That must be so cool to publish a book with Noam Chomsky." I'm like, yeah, but also, have you read it? Because basically, it's documenting all these terrible atrocities, and warning that things are going to get worse unless we all act. But I'm really glad we have it and that I was able to do it, because I do think that I found his analysis so powerful, and I wanted that to be able to be shared with a new generation of readers who can read it, who can see the record that is often buried, and who can really take to heart what he says about responsibility and capability. That is to say, once you see this, once you know this, it confers upon you a moral responsibility to try and do something about it. And also, you have the capacity, ordinary people have the capacity to change these things. Don't feel demoralized, don't feel powerless. People want you to feel powerless and hopeless, and they want you to not challenge these things. But if we organize, we can, in fact, prevent the worst from occurring, which is always a real core part of his message. So I'm really glad we have that in this form, and I hope people will share it with everyone who needs to hear it.
Well, I recommend it. I think it's a very accessible overview of Professor Chomsky's thinking of the behavior of the American military empire over the last 75 years and what we should be doing about it. So, Nathan J. Robinson, thank you for your hard work in co-authoring this with Professor Chomsky. Congratulations on its publication. Again, the book is The Myth of American Idealism: How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World. And as always, Nathan, thanks for coming on the program.
Nice to be with you, RJ.